The rationales, the other positions, the reasons they're doing the things they're doing are things that we don't have in the world anymore. For instance, Paul, who is the biggest opponent of same-sex intercourse, was an opponent of sex in general. He wanted everybody to be celibate. And he suggested that if you could not hack celibacy, if you couldn't make it work, go ahead and get married, but then only have just enough dispassionate sex to make you not want to have sex. So sex served a prophylactic function in Paul's sexual ethic.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 154 for the 23rd of March, 2023. I don't talk much about Jordan Peterson. I don't think that he is as interesting a character as the internet makes out. I certainly don't think that he's as interesting as he thinks he is himself. In case you've been living under a rock for the past few years, he's a Canadian clinical psychologist and university professor who got a lot of attention for what seemed to me pretty basic psychological observations. I think that he got that attention because he couched those observations in terms that appealed to a right-wing audience. I don't think it would be fair to call him alt-right. He doesn't seem to like the extreme right, but they do seem to like him because he was able to articulate criticisms of the left in an impressive sounding way, and they were happy to ignore his criticisms of the right, which, to be fair, he did make. This fan base has earned him sacks of money, from Patreon sponsorship to massive book deals and speaking tours. So, fine, there are lots of authors that I'm skeptical of. And I have to say, he made one case for conservatism, political conservatism. Basically, he says that the way our society is set up has got us all here to where we are today. Over evolutionary time, more than 99% of all species have gone extinct. Over the past few million years, a whole slew of hominids, our cousins, have gone extinct. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and so on. And from prehistory to today, many societies of modern humans, many cultures, many groups have essentially been wiped out, either by forces internal or external. But we haven't. By definition, whatever we've been doing up to now works, because it got us here. Peterson's argument, essentially, is that we should be very careful changing what we know works for the latest fad, some bright idealistic way to reform society, because there's no certainty that idea will work, and we do have certainty that what we have been doing up to now does work, for us anyway. That argument is not as strong as Peterson thinks it is, because one of the things that has got us here today is that we innovate. That's what humans do. We're good at adapting to new situations. Penguins live quite well in the Antarctic, but I don't think they would do well competing with lions in the tropical jungle. Humans, by contrast, can live in both and many more environments too. But despite that weakness, his point is valid. Now, Peterson started off by commenting based on his experience in psychology, and he's well qualified in that area. But since he hit the jackpot of book deals and speaking tours, he has massively expanded the areas that he is eager to comment on, everything from Brexit to climate change. And unlike with psychology, he has no qualifications to talk on these topics, and it shows. It's very obvious that he is producing content on demand for his right-leaning audience. Despite his unfamiliarity with the topics he's talking about, he still maintains that snarky tone of someone who knows that he's better qualified than his opponent and wants to let everyone else know that. In this vein, he retweeted recently a chart from a climate change denying Twitter account, which purports to show the last 10,000 years of temperature record, with the recent increase in global temperatures being dwarfed by much bigger swings in the Roman and Minoan warm periods. The chart is laughably wrong. Firstly, it doesn't show global temperature, it shows the interpretation of a single ice core. It is possible for historic temperatures to be worked out by studying long frozen ice, but this is done by taking thousands of samples, not just one. But most of all, the data on his chart stops at 1885. You heard that right. The years are marked in tiny numbers at the bottom, but there's no data at all on the chart for almost the last 150 years, so it obviously doesn't tell us anything at all about the extent of recent climate change. The data series on the chart is also zoomed in a way to make temperature changes like the Roman and Minoan warm periods seem enormous, and it makes a small uptick at the end of the chart, circled in red, look tiny. That small uptick is labelled sarcastically on the chart as the, quote, supposedly unprecedented warmth of the present climate. But, of course, it's no such thing because, as I said, the end of the chart is 1885. But Peterson tweeted this chart with the ironic comment, "Anyone object to this chart?" This chart, by the way, has been doing the rounds of climate change denying blogs and Twitter accounts for years, and it has been entirely debunked. Now, there is a better chart of the global temperature trends for the past 10,000 years. It's for the last 22,000 years, actually. The graph uses multiple independent sources of temperature records, thousands of them. It goes right up to the present day, and it's based on the work by Dr. Matt Osman of the University of Arizona, and it's been peer-reviewed and published in the highly respected scientific journal Nature. I'm putting links to all of these and the graphics involved on the blog post for this podcast, by the way. Osman's graph shows the temperature bouncing around in prehistoric time and then getting significantly warmer about 10,000 years ago, and being remarkably stable from then until very recently. Basically, global temperature is a flat line from 10,000 years ago until when our grandparents were born, and since then it has spiked up sharply and is predicted to increase even further. 10,000 years ago is significant, very significant. 10,000 years ago is when the last ice age was ending. Mammoths were dying, sea levels rose, the world got warmer, stably warmer, and civilization in Mesopotamia and then other areas flourished. Humans changed from being hunter-gatherers to farming, domesticating livestock and raising crops. Farming was a far more efficient way of producing food, so people who all had to work all day long just to eat before could now do things like bake bread from flour and use other long-lasting foods. And they could also invent architecture and build everything from the pyramids to Newgrange, and invent writing and get educated. And that created a snowball effect where knowledge is efficiently stored and passed on. And that gave us our modern society. All of that happened in the last 10,000 years in a period of remarkable climate stability. It is safe to say that it could not have happened at any other time where there are quite sharp swings in climates. You couldn't invent agriculture unless the same crops could grow in the same place for extended periods, and you couldn't do any of the other things unless you invented agriculture and liberated a huge amount of time that would otherwise have been spent on foraging for food. The other thing that the chart from Dr. Osman and his team shows is that the global temperature increase that we have already experienced brings the global temperature well outside the range of temperature stability that we had for the whole existence of human civilization. But the future scenarios, based on high, medium and low carbon emissions, bring us much further. The high emissions scenario basically means keeping on doing what we're doing now. That would lead to temperatures far away from the happy medium that our civilization grew up in. It's even far outside the range that our hunter-gatherer ancestors experienced when they spent the whole of their days and the whole of their short, miserable lives scraping what they could from the dirt to have enough to eat. And Peterson's point is correct. There's no inevitability of the survival of our society. We've survived this far because conditions favoured us. Change them radically in an unthinking way and, like the 99% of species that have gone the way of the dodo, there's no guarantee that we will survive for much longer either. We are busily creating an Earth upon which we have no idea how to live in large numbers and reasonable comfort. That's a challenging idea. That's an idea that should alarm any genuine conservative. But it's not an idea for a huckster who makes millions by peddling whatever he thinks will get his fanboys paying for his latest book. In a moment, we'll have the interview, but first, I want to say thanks to all of the patrons. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. We don't get a huge amount of money. We're not in the same league as some other Irish podcasters, but it pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. It's also a great morale booster. We're always happy to get a new patron. It shows that some people out there are listening and appreciating the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of an Irish Times once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
All right, let's hear it.
On the line, I have Dan McClellan. He has a PhD in theology and religion from the University of Exeter. He lists himself as a public scholar of the Bible and of religion. He was, for 10 years, a scripture translation supervisor for the Church of Latter-day Saints. That's the Mormons to you and me. And he's the author of a book. And Dan, I'm not sure how to pronounce the title of your book. Can you help me out on that?
Well, normally that's pronounced YHWH. That's the scholarly pronunciation of the divine name. But I've made a promise to my audience, many of whom are Jewish folks, that I wouldn't, in my public appearances, pronounce the divine name. So I pronounce it Adonai's divine images.
Okay, so the book, as I see the title, has YHWH's divine images. I won't follow the stricture that you do. That's an abbreviation or a contraction of Yahweh. And you do see that, I think, in some Jewish Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox documents and signs or something. Even in English, they write G-D rather than the word God. And I think the audience will know by now, with that short introduction, that you are deeply interested in the Bible. And am I correct in thinking that if you were a scripture translation supervisor for the Church of Latter-day Saints, that you're a member of that church? Or do you want to say what your position is there?
I am an active member of the church, but I do my best to try to mitigate any influence from my devotional side in my public scholarship. So I try to only represent the academic side of things.
Yeah, and you have a whole series of videos on YouTube, I think also on TikTok, which are incredibly impressive from an academic point of view. And you make very, very obscure Bible details very interesting to me, as at least. Other people can comment for themselves. And I think it's really hard to overstate how maybe nerdy is the word of this. If we took all the nerds on biblical studies on the universe and put them all on one planet, then I think your head would be that planet. But why does that matter?
I think it matters because, well, part of the reason that I got onto social media and started sharing this scholarship was because I was seeing a lot of misinformation being shared. And it's one thing for, nerds to just share mistakes that they make and misinformation, but this stuff is being shared all around the world. This stuff is influencing the way people think about the world, the way people interact with the world, the way politicians operate. And so because it is so influential and because this misinformation can be so damaging and can harm other people's lives, I thought there needs to be somebody out there, to use an American metaphor of baseball, calling balls and strikes, just trying to call them as they see them, and providing what people can trust to be, to the degree possible, objective, unbiased data regarding these issues, and so that people can come to their own conclusions and can see through the misinformation and the exploitation and the misleading rhetoric that is out there.
Okay, and then I guess people perhaps who don't know your format might not know that what you typically do is you find some video or some statement by someone who is, and we have a saying in Ireland, sometimes they're using the Bible as a drunk uses a lamppost. They're using it for support rather than illumination. And you, I think, try to criticize people who are, making claims based on what they say is in the Bible. Can you give me some of the most egregious examples of the misinformation that you've encountered on that?
There's quite a bit, and recently, in fact, I've got a video that will be coming out shortly on my channel that addresses end times prophecies misinformation. There are a lot of folks online that are suggesting the drought in Iraq that is lowering the water levels in the Euphrates is the beginning of the fulfillment of a prophecy from the book of Revelation about 4 angels that are bound under the Euphrates River that are going to be released to kill 1/3 of humankind once the Euphrates River is dry. And this is, as I've pointed out in a number of videos, conflating 2 different chapters from the book of Revelation into one, and then misreading that conflated narrative to turn this into a prophecy. And so these are folks who have an idea in their head and are trying to connect it with events that are going on in the world, and so misread, massage, manipulate the text in order to make it sound like this is the fulfillment of this prophecy. And that's just remarkably harmful, particularly for people out there who don't know any better.
Why is that harmful?
Well, there are a number of things that are influenced by public opinion. For instance, in the United States, we have to deal with a lot of climate change issues. And for people who believe that this world is coming to an end and that we have no responsibility to care for the earth or that God is in charge of it all anyway, a lot of those people sit in positions of power in state legislatures and even in the U.S. Congress. And they're making decisions about how we're responding to climate change problems. And for the most part, they're ignoring it. And so here in Utah, for instance, a pregnant woman is more likely to lose her baby because of poor air quality in our state. And so it's literally killing people. And we're not doing anything about it because the people in power have decided they're going to latch onto this rhetoric about their voter base, the people who are conservative, religious folks. They don't want us to do anything about it. They just want to let God take care of things. And so the end times prophecies are related to that, this idea that everything's wrapping up soon anyway, and so we don't have to pay attention to things. We don't have to try to fix social issues. We don't have to address climate change. We don't have to do all of this because God's bringing the world to an end shortly anyway. And the more soon this end of the world is going to happen, the less we need to worry about things going on further down the line.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that because I think that's a very interesting topic, but I want you to clear up the definition of one word for the listeners first. What is univocalism?
So that's the notion that the biblical text, or whatever text a person is talking about, speaks with one single unified voice. Mm-hmm. And what that does for a person is that means you can take one passage from one side of the Bible and another passage from another side of the Bible and presume that both of these passages are representing the same perspective. And so if they seem like they conflict, we have to find a way to make them agree. We have to harmonize them. And that means that you've got to decide which passage is going to take priority, which one is going to be subjugated or subordinated to the other. And it allows you to negotiate with the text and manipulate the text. And so when we presume univocality, that serves our using the text to do whatever we want it to do, to make it more useful or meaningful to us. So I like that analogy. A drunk uses a lamppost. They are trying to get that lamppost just the way they like it so that their leaning on it can be most comfortable or most useful to them.
Okay, I think you may well be correct, but it strikes me that this notion of rejecting what's called univocality or univocalism. In other words, accepting that the Bible was written across quite a wide time span by a whole bunch of different people who had different biases and different social contexts and so forth. Isn't that fundamentally incompatible with believing that the Bible is the Word of God, which is really the basis of being a Christian?
I think there is a worldview that has been developed over the last few hundred years that wants to see it that way. But I think that's a product of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment, because one of the things that those movements did was put a lot more rational attention on the Bible and question the Bible from a rational point of view. And so in response, in reaction, we had a lot of Bible believers come back and say, no, it's all true, and adopt some of the rationalist perspectives in defense of their belief in revealed religion over and against rational religion. Those are two of the factions that kind of developed during this time period. And so the idea of inerrancy...
Pause with that idea, because however you or I, and I guess you mentioned you're in Utah, our audience is largely in Ireland. I would have to say our audience in particular, and probably Ireland in general, is considerably less attached to sacred texts than the people you might necessarily encounter in Utah. But isn't the people who say, this is the Word of God, anything else is wrong? However, people coming from a secular point of view might reject that and think that even a silly thing to say. It is at least consistent because the schools of thought that have said that large chunks of the Bible are allegory or are not meant to be taken literally, and who sometimes take what is, I think, pejoratively called a pick and mix attitude to the Bible. At least the fundamentalists can say that they're being consistent, can't they?
To some degree, but there's also a degree they're rejecting a lot of their tradition, because some of the earliest Christians developed hermeneutical approaches, so ways to approach interpreting the biblical text that allowed for allegorical meaning, that allowed for things to be inconsistent, so that it served the use of Scripture to promote and develop their worldview. So Origen of Alexandria, for instance, there was a passage, there's a imprecatory psalm, I believe it's 137, there's a part that says, "Blessed or happy are they who will dash your babies against the rocks." And this is kind of condemnation of Babylon. But early Christians had to figure out a way to make it okay that this was the Word of God. And so Origen came up with the idea that there are 4 different levels of interpreting Scripture. And one of them is
so
a moral
I think
level.
people might have missed that. So essentially the Bible essentially enjoined the Israelites who were imprisoned in Babylon to dash the heads of the babies of the people of Babylon who were imprisoning them against the rocks. This is in the Bible, and that's quite difficult to justify. And the way to justify it is, as you were going to say, am I correct?
Yeah, so what Origen of Alexandria comes up with is reading this text not as a literal reference to Israelites killing Babylonian babies, but as a reference to sin, saying the little children of Babylon are our sins and our sinful thoughts, and so we must take the sinful thoughts and dash them against the rocks. And that's a way to say this isn't literal. We need to understand this in a different way to reconcile it with our own ethical frameworks and with our own worldviews. And there have been a number of different Christians since the 1st century CE that have found different ways to approach the Bible in order to iron out a lot of the problematic aspects.
Okay,
it.
well then you're the scholar on this, and you're the person who should know. We don't have anybody to go back to ancient Babylon to ask, but I think you're the next best thing. When the person who wrote that about dashing the heads of the babies of the people of Babylon on the rocks, in your view, what was that person thinking? What did they think they were writing?
I think this was a person who was coming out of the Babylonian exile and viewed Babylon as kind of a symbol of all that is evil. So I can't speak for Ireland, but at least I know in the States a lot of people think of, for instance, ISIS as kind of the symbol of all that is evil. And so I think the writer of this psalm, from a position within the Judahite nation, is just kind of fantasizing about being able to do to Babylon what was done to them. So
sure, but if you believe that this, and it's clearly a recommendation, there's nothing of this description that would allow somebody to believe that this is not being something that is advocated for, whatever it is they're advocating, whether it's real babies or symbolic babies. But it does seem that in very many cases, in order to adapt the Bible to be acceptable even to the most extreme of modern sensibilities, you need to do an awful lot of work.
Yeah, and I refer to that as negotiating with the Bible. That's something that everybody has to do, just because nobody's reading it in a vacuum. We are all bringing a lifetime of experiences and perspectives within specific circumstances. We're bringing that all to the Bible as we read. And so what we interpret within the Bible is usually going to be whatever it needs to be to make the Bible more meaningful or more useful to us. So
or more acceptable?
And I think that it becomes acceptable when it is something that brings more meaning to our own experiences, that allows us to see our own experiences in the text, that allows us to feel like we're being guided by God. I think that's a lot of what's going on. And yes, the text needs to be made more acceptable in certain contexts so that we can defend it, so that we can feel validated in our belief in its inspired nature, so that we can win arguments with other people, for instance. The notion that the Bible is inerrant is rooted in the need to deploy the Bible as a rhetorical weapon against arguments that might undermine our worldview. And so there are a lot of different ways that people negotiate with the text, and it's very selective. Sometimes we want the Bible to be literal, other times we want the Bible to be figurative so that we can deny the literal meaning, because that may complicate things.
Okay, but to bring that round in a circle, because you say that your videos, and they're really excellent, I can't recommend them highly enough. I will put links both to your YouTube and to your TikTok for anybody who wants to donate their data to the Chinese government. I'll put links for those on the page for this website. But you mentioned about countering misinformation. To the extent that you say you and everybody negotiates the meaning of the Bible in the way that you use that word, what counts as misinformation in that case?
Well, I think that what scholars try to do is, there's no meaning in the text to be excavated. We have to bring all the meaning to the text, and we can either be doing so with the aim of supporting ourselves today and our own identity politics, or we can try to reconstruct the experiences, the worldviews, the interpretive frameworks that the original authors would have had. And that's always... that's never an exact match. It's always just a rough approximation.
Are you sure it's an approximation?
Sometimes we don't know. There are a number of cases where there are readings.
Surely there's sometimes we really know it's not.
Yeah, and that's where I come in to say this is most likely misinformation, and particularly when people are mixing the texts and imposing interpretive frameworks that have only recently developed. For instance, a lot of people recently are pointing to passages in Isaiah and saying, see, they knew the earth was a globe, was a sphere anciently. And we can look at the way the words they're talking about have been used in the Bible and elsewhere, and it's very clearly not the case. So that I would say is misinformation. That's an attempt to say our scientific understanding today was miraculously known to the ancient world, and there's absolutely no data that indicate that. And so, yeah, there are certain times when we can be more confident, and there are other times where we cannot be as confident in our reconstruction of what they likely thought the text meant. But when we can be more confident, that's where I'm going to put a more critical eye on the way people are deploying the text today, and particularly as a weapon against, for instance, minoritized groups, marginalized groups like the LGBTQ plus community. We get a lot of misinformation about the Bible, and that's not to say that.
Well, I'll pause you on that one. Does the Bible condemn homosexuality?
If you understand homosexuality to refer to a sexual orientation, then absolutely not.
No.
Right.
Then I should be more specific to homosexual sex.
I think that there are passages that do condemn certain acts of same-sex intercourse. Mm-hmm. However, what I usually talk about when I address that question is that we can reconstruct the rationales, the reasonings that contributed to that opposition, and we can see the social forces at work in kind of nuancing why and when they had opposition to it. And we can also show that they had a lot of other positions on sexual ethics that are all totally alien to today. The rationales, the other positions, the reasons they're doing the things they're doing are things that we don't have in the world anymore. For instance, Paul, who is the biggest opponent of same-sex intercourse, was an opponent of sex in general. He wanted everybody to be celibate. Mm-hmm. And he suggested that if you could not hack celibacy, if you couldn't make it work, go ahead and get married, but then only have just enough dispassionate sex to make you not want to have sex. So sex served a prophylactic function in Paul's sexual ethic. And so when people say, well, what about Paul? I say, well, what about Paul? You already reject so much of his sexual ethic just because it doesn't fit today. Why must his rejection of same-sex intercourse, based on these phenomenally outdated scientific and social ideas, these hierarchies of domination, why don't you reject that as well? You reject his support of slavery. You reject his support of the subordination of women. But for some reason, we're going to allow his idea about same-sex intercourse to be authoritative. That's inconsistent on the part of people who wield those scriptures that way. They're negotiating with the text.
That's correct. And I want to kind of put that point in suspended animation for a little bit. I should say for listeners who didn't pick up the reference, Paul there, you're referring to the Apostle Paul, who never met Jesus but lived in the decades perhaps after he died and became one of the greater spreaders of Christianity in those very early years after the death of Jesus. But I just want to, perhaps we can have a little fun. I will come back to those points. But
okay.
Is it true the 10 Commandments are not mentioned in the Bible?
Well, we don't have the phrase 10 Commandments, at least not in Exodus 20, which is where we generally pull our thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal, those 10 Commandments. There's nothing that refers to them as
That's not called the 10 Commandments. Okay, but it's mentioned somewhere else, is it?
So we have in Exodus 34, we have another list of 10 commandments, and scholars generally refer to this as the ritual decalogue because it's actually focused more on your feasts and your rituals and how to do them correctly. And at the very end, it refers to these as the 10 words or the 10 things or the 10 verses. Mm-hmm. And in the 16th century, as English Bibles were being translated, the Geneva Bible, as far as I'm aware, was the first to actually translate this. Previously, it had been the 10 verses. The Geneva Bible changed it to the 10 Commandments, and that was picked up in the King James Version, and that's been the traditional designation for our 10 Commandments, even though in the Bible, that refers to a completely different set of commandments that very few people are familiar with.
Okay, I should say, I think from my research, the Geneva Bible was translated for the advent of, was it Calvinism in Geneva and the far east of France. So it was a Bible that was independent of the Catholic Church. Did David really kill Goliath?
So that's another interesting one. We've got the story in 1 Samuel of the Israelite champion David coming out and killing Goliath. But we've got another reference to Goliath, and it's very clearly the same Goliath because it describes him in the exact same way as having whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And if we look in 2 Samuel as well as in 1 Chronicles, we have this very short passage where it refers to a man named Elchanan having killed Goliath, and it says whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And this seems to be a separate telling of the same story, attributing the death of Goliath to another figure. And in the 1 Chronicles passage, we have a slight change to the text, where it says that this was the brother of Goliath who was killed. And the text is a little manipulated. Some of the letters in Hebrew can be confused with other letters, and so the author of Chronicles seems to have manipulated the text because they know that it's supposed to be David who killed Goliath. But the reality is probably that we have this preservation of this early tradition in 2 Samuel, and then somewhere along the way they were like, that sounds like a really cool story. We're going to attribute that to David. And so the story of David's life and David's rise to the throne was probably elaborated on, sprinkled with a bunch of things that were actually done by other people. And we just happen to have this little hint preserved elsewhere in 2 Samuel because of an editor not being careful enough with how they're representing the text.
Okay, and I guess the question every schoolboy asked, if Cain and Abel were Adam and Eve's children, how did they go on to have more babies? And I saw a thing saying that actually Cain lived in a largely populated world. Is this true?
So what scholars would say here is that the story of the Garden of Eden, Genesis 2 and 3, originally circulated separately from the story of Cain that begins in Genesis 4. And that when the two of them were brought together, we now have this narrative incongruity, that the story of Cain originally was told from the perspective of, a civilized, inhabited world. And then it was brought together, and now we've got this kind of incongruity. And so many scholars would say those are just two independent stories. But at some point along the way, they got brought together, and other people, no doubt anciently, people asked the same question. But there seems to have been a way to handle this anciently as well. Because if you look at Genesis 1, we seem to have a separate creation account. And scholars also agree that these two creation accounts circulated independently. But in Genesis 1, it refers to God creating man and woman in his image and his likeness. And then in Genesis 2, we have God creating Adam, breathing the breath of life into his nostrils, and then from Adam's side creating woman. And so anciently, it seems that readers looked at this and said, okay, there was a first initial creation of males and females, and that's not limited to a single individual. That could be interpreted collectively. So God created humankind, and then later we have the story of Adam and Eve. So it could be interpreted, and probably was interpreted anciently, as kind of a twofold creation. Humanity is created, and then later we have these individuals that we call Adam and Eve created. And so by the time they have a child, Cain, the initial creation of all humanity has already populated the earth. Now, that's not how people tend to read it today. They tend to treat the two creation accounts as two different perspectives on a single creation account. But anciently, they may have made sense of that convoluted narrative by reading it that way.
Okay. I'm interested, and that's very interesting things. It's certainly not what we got in junior school religion classes or anything where you learn about the Bible. And I'm just interested in how that addresses a much more current debate, and I'm sure you're aware of I think, very strongly atheist commentator Sam Harris, also from the US. Mm-hmm. And he has taken on a number of religious figures, and he seems to take up against, you can characterize perhaps the debate between the two of them, of the religious figures saying that we need a final authority external to mankind in order to have any sort of morality. And Sam Harris has attempted to argue against that. And the criticism of his position is that, how do you know? How can you say that murdering somebody isn't a bad thing to do if you don't have any absolute moral compass, if you don't have any point of absolute morality external to humanity. And clearly the implication, and sometimes explicitly said, is that the source of this absoluteness in morality is the Bible. From what you're saying, that seems to me to be absolutely impossible. Would you have to be on Sam Harris's side on that debate?
Regarding the notion of absolute morality, I would probably be on Sam's side, just because the Bible does not function as an absolute signpost for morality. It has to be negotiated. It has been understood in so many different ways, from time to time, from place to place, from person to person, that it's obviously not a beacon of absolute morality. So I've already talked about a couple of different ways that are the moral frameworks that we bring to the Bible and the moral frameworks that we extract from it are products of our own experiences and our own perspectives and our own circumstances. So it's already not an absolute moral position. It's something that's negotiable. It's something that has changed over time.
So to the extent that the Bible has morality, it is because the human reader has brought it to the Bible.
Exactly. I think that the Bible provides kind of interpretive guidelines, maybe guardrails, but there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of variability within those strictures, and people have interpreted a bunch of different ways. But to say the Bible is our standard, our absolute moral code, is a way to structure power, so that the ones who have authority over the Bible ultimately have authority over everyone. That's, I think, what the rhetorical goal is of that argument.
Do you think it's a little bit like going back to the Middle Ages, when in the pre-Reformation Catholic Church it was considered a sin to read the Bible? There was great resistance to it being translated into the vernacular, and they very much wanted to have at least the priest in between the Bible and the congregation in order to essentially control that power.
I think there's definitely a relationship there. It's about structuring power, but similar things go on today, even within the secular world. I mean, I set myself up as an authority on the Bible, and I think I have the experience in the background to be more reliable about it than many other folks. But I'm doing the same thing, trying to set myself up to some degree as the mediator between the people and the text. However, I'm not saying you're not allowed to read it without me. I'm just saying, hey, if you're going to approach it, at least be better informed about it.
Sure. And you can comment on it. I'll give you my own view that if someone is to say, well, there has to be some ultimate source of absolute morality, then I would say the Bible is a very bad candidate for that. And if we look, there are various things that are perhaps morally difficult, and even killing is morally difficult. If your country is at war and being attacked, is it moral to kill the people who are attacking them? That makes that difficult. But there are a couple of very easy moral questions. For example, slavery, and for example, rape. And the Bible is absolutely not clear and coherent in its condemnation of those, certainly not in the way that our current society is. And indeed, in many cases, you may comment on this, it certainly appears to endorse both rape and slavery. And you can comment on that, whether you think you agree with that or not in a moment. But what I see from that is that somebody who argues in favor of absolute morality doesn't have an absolute place to take it from.
I agree 100% that it's holding up the Bible as something absolute while also having to negotiate with it and having to wrestle with a lot of inconsistencies and wrestle with the fact that, we treat slavery as an absolute evil. For the most part, most of us do today. And in the Bible, it is part of the fabric of the society. It's never questioned. When we talk about fish not knowing that they're swimming around in water, they just did not think about slavery as something that was, negotiable back then. It was just the reality. And they didn't question it. They just figured out how to work within it. But you also have positions that are based on identity politics, where when they do slavery to us, it's bad. When we do slavery to them, it's just fine. And similarly, how they understood what rape was very different back then. But in a similar way, if someone else did it to our children, or to us, that's bad. But you also have Moses saying, when, slaughter all the Amalekites except for the virgin girls, you get to keep them for yourselves. And that is almost certainly a reference to keeping them as sexual slaves. So, which, according to our understanding of agency today, would constitute rape. But they would have thought about it differently back then as well. And so it's dangerous to hold those things up as absolute moral positions, because you have to find a reason to either say, we're different today, or you have to find some way to try to rationalize why it should be okay to do those things today. And either way, your negotiation is probably going to involve a lot of manipulation and misinformation.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of hard work.
Yeah. I wish people would take the easy route of just trying to understand the Bible within its historical context, which itself is hard work, but can't be as hard as trying to make genocide and rape okay.
Yeah, you have kind of arrived at the ultimate idea that I wanted to kind of get to. And you were a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. Obviously, you worked for them using your great knowledge and scholarship for a long time. Irish people may not be familiar with that church at all. The name Mormons is probably much more familiar to Irish people, and probably most Irish people's the bulk of their knowledge about that church would come from an episode of South Park, which I'm sure you're aware of. I don't know how you view it, but what you're describing, and I think you describe it incredibly well from both an accessible point of view and from a scholarly point of view, but it seems like an amalgam of oral stories, old wives' tales, bitter feuding, and urban legends that was put together because a particular tribe or a few particular tribes came together and were able to write when the people around them were not, and became influential because of that. And I have to put the question to you, why are you devoting your life to this? And in particular, would devoting your life to the sort of things on TikTok of, I don't know, teenagers singing into their hairbrush, miming songs in their bedrooms be any less meaningful than that?
So I think the Bible has influenced the world for good or for evil. It is the single most influential text that has ever existed.
Sure.
And I started devoting my life to it because I wanted to better understand it. I wanted to be able to know when it was being used for good, when it was being used for evil. And as I learn more and more about it and the academic study of it, I see how misused it can be, and I see the harm that it can do. And I lived for 2 years in Uruguay in South America as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
You were one of those people with a white shirt and a little a little pin on it that said Elder McClellan, and tried to stop people in the street and ask them, did they want to come to a concert about Jesus? Yeah?
Something like that, yeah. I saw how Christianity and other religions operated outside of the United States and in other languages, and I saw how the Bible functioned. And I had the privilege and the opportunity to live in the UK, in England, when I did one of my master's degrees, and then I went up to Canada for another one. And I've seen how religion and the Bible can function in a lot of different contexts, and it has just fascinated me more and more. The more I see, the more it fascinates me, but the more it troubles me as well. And so I would say that today I continue to devote my life to the study of the Bible, because I see that there is an virtually infinite amount of good that can come out of it, but a virtually infinite amount of evil that can come out of it as well. And I'd like to be a force for the former, and I'd like to be a foil to the latter. And I think that I'm trying to set an example for my children as well, so that as they grow and as they figure out what kind of relationship they will or will not have with this text, I want them to be able to see how it can be used responsibly, and also to get to know a lot of the wonderful people around the world who are engaged in the same effort to try to take something that can be deployed for unspeakable evil and revert to using it for good, to help bring people together. And I think it can serve that function. I think that that is an impossible goal to get everybody on that side of the line. But I think there are a lot of good people out there who can help us try to. We're not going to get rid of it. It can't just be destroyed. It's not going to go away. But I think we ought to try to show as many people as possible that we can understand it in a way that benefits society and that benefits the people who are on the margins of society. And unfortunately, that's not the way that things are trending these days. At least in my country. I don't know about your country, but I'd like to try to change that.
Dan McClellan, PhD in theology and religion, public scholar on the Bible, and TikTok star who doesn't sing into his hairbrush in his bedroom. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Dan McClellan at McClellan, that's McLellan. And get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic that we could feature in an upcoming show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. As I said, it covers the cost of keeping the podcast going. And if you could throw in the price of an Irish Times or even a copy of the Beano once or twice a month, then please do go and sign up at patreon.com/Here's How. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.